This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Is it possible to literally scare the hell out of somebody? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. That'll be our topic of discussion tonight. I mean that in a literal sense. Can you use horror to actually illustrate spiritual truth? We will discuss that tonight with our panel for our monthly Iron and Myth series, and I think we may reach a conclusion that surprises, if not you, then at least someone else who is watching or listening to this program tonight. By the way, please take a moment, especially if you're watching this program on YouTube. If you're watching at YouTube, our youtube.com/Gilbert House channel, God bless you. Share, click the link, subscribe, do all that, but then take a moment and download our free app, because at some point we are likely to say something that will get us kicked out of the sandbox. That's almost happened. Of course, it's happened to Skywatch TV. In fact, just last week it happened to the women's program at Skywatch TV, Simply His. I mean, these are the nicest, gentlest ladies you would ever want to meet. I mean, Catherine Horn, Donna Howell, Nita Horn. I mean, these are genuinely sweet and gentle people who give sacrificially of themselves. The work that they do at Whispering Ponies Ranch, much of which is unseen by the public at large, is truly commendable and outstanding. And yet they said something that got the Simply His YouTube channel yanked. Don't know what it was. So that's just illustrates the point, because they've gone back into our files, our archives, a couple of times now and found old programs. One was 18 months ago, one was 3 years ago, and hit us with a strike. So if we're really good for a little while longer, they'll drop the strike. But if not, well, another strike comes up and we're off for good. So just to make sure you don't get canceled, or we don't get canceled or cut off from you if you are getting some value from these programs, please get our app, iOS, Android, Amazon, Kindle, Fire. You'll find it at gilberthouse.org/app. So joining us to discuss horror and its use as an apologetics tool, the director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology and author of a number of books, including Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim, Dr. Judd Burton, best-selling author and award-winning screenwriter Brian Godawa. Oh, he's got some really interesting stuff coming in the near future. We'll talk with him about that in the weeks ahead. And the man who discovered the Serpent Mound of Bashan, author of Giants, Sons of the Gods, now available in a special 10th anniversary revised and expanded edition, Doug Van Dorn. Telling horror stories with a supernatural twist, I mean, that's common. I mean, a lot of horror fiction, horror films, horror series on television feature supernatural plot lines. Is there a way we can use this? Or maybe the better way of putting this is, how can we, as Christians, use this genre to actually illustrate supernatural spiritual truth? Brian, this is something that's right up your alley. So I'm glad that Doug suggested this last month, because we're surrounded by it. I mean, some of the most popular programs, series on television, the Walking Dead series, some of the most popular horror fiction over the last half century or so, Stephen King, a lot of supernatural themes, but not necessarily from a Christian perspective. I mean, how do we as Christians take this and use it?
Well, and of course, the issue when we talk about horror, what comes to our minds, to most people's minds, is, the nubile young co-eds being hunted by the serial killer and they have sex and then they get murdered in grotesque ways, or, the hybrid monsters hunting people and blood and gore, and it's sometimes in some ways it's like the worst of horror comes to our mind with that term, and I think that it was the kind of thing that even for me as a Christian, I had to wrestle with, early on in my storytelling aspect of my life, because as a storyteller, you of course traffic in those kinds of things, and so much so that I ended up writing an article on this issue of apologetics, or of horror as an apologetic, And it's important because of these extreme sort of grotesque concepts of horror that we have in our minds. It makes it oftentimes difficult for Christians, certainly, to either, accept it as a genre for storytelling, or even defend it. Like many times it's often attacked as being, this is demonic just in and of itself. And if you are, and I've written stories and such where people will, respond, this is demonic, just by looking at what the story's about. They don't even know what the story is. They just see the genre of it as horror, right? And, this goes with serial killer stories as well. They're a kind of horror as well. But so I felt that was important to, certainly to address that issue from the Bible. And that's one of the reasons why I did. So hopefully we'll have a link there to the article on the video that we have up here. But so I sort of wanted us to talk tonight about what I consider to be the three main three of the main purposes of horror. Of course, there's lots of reasons, but first is to understand horror as a genre and realize that it's not just it's a genre of storytelling which has specific purposes behind it, why they do the things they do. And I kind of came up with three main important elements that we can hopefully talk about. And that is, first, horror as a genre tends to be very powerful in today's postmodern world, specifically, of course, any sinful world, right, that denies man's sinful nature. Particularly, though, in our postmodern world of relativism, right, where particularly now there's no objective reality. You Christians are bigots for calling things evil, and you're dichotomizing. You're making distinctions between things and such. And so, in a postmodern relativistic world, horror is a powerful means of affirming the doctrine of original sin or man's sinful nature. And then, secondly, it's a powerful genre for communicating the consequences of sin. You see what evil results in, which these are all biblical things. We'll talk about them. And then thirdly would be it's sort of a prophetic social commentary. Horror can be a commentary on society, and it often is. And I think hopefully we will be able to bring up passages, we're not here tonight. As you guys know us, we're not, you audience members know us, we're not just here to sort of defend something. We want to see biblically, how does this stuff fare out? And we've had a previous episode where we talked specifically about movies and series that have like the Watchers and the supernatural in them. And so hopefully our goal here is to address beyond just that into the more other elements of horror and how they're used in storytelling in the Bible. And so that's how I kind of see it. Of course, as we talk, you guys bring in whatever you want to bring in. But if I could just sort of launch the discussion, and again, think of passages. But first of all, the genre of horror itself. As an evangelical Christian, I always like to have the Bible. I have Bible verses to prove everything. I still kind of got that in me, and I love it. Proof texts and such. But one of the things that I think helped me to really start to reconsider my initial sort of negative reaction to horror is to face the fact that, hey, wait a minute. As I look closely, there's a lot of horror in the Bible, and when I say horror, not just like there are horrible true events of violence and such, because there are that, but horror as a storytelling means, like sometimes fictional or at least symbolic means of communicating spiritual truths, right? And the biggest two of my favorite books in the Bible are Daniel and Revelation. And when you look at these books, what are the things you see in there? They're very horror, whether it's giant genetic mutated monsters, to what have you. We could, go through some of these examples, but facing the fact that, wait a minute, now those are symbolic prophecies, or prophecies that symbolize something true in our history, but it's using these demonic creatures and things to describe that demonic spiritual world. But they're very much symbols, very much like a horror movie or a horror novel would be a metaphor for these things as well, So I don't know if there are any particular, what are some of your guys' favorite horror stories that you've found in the Bible?
Well, Judd, you actually teach on monsterology at the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. What would you? How would you answer that question?
Well, there's really, not to turn the Bible into a horror novel necessarily, but there's certainly plenty of horrific imagery and stories and mythology within the context of the Bible. As you point out, I do teach a program called Preternatural Morphology, which sort of looks at monsters through the biblical lens, the like the werewolf and the ghoul and the vampire, some of the more well known of these near perennial monsters that sort of exist in world mythology, and the Bible's no exception. Now, as far as one of, if we can call it as such, cautiously, one of the most horrific elements, I think, is this vampire motif that exists within the Bible, presented in the characters of not just Lilith that we see showing up in Isaiah and I think in a number of places in the Psalms, but also there are other creatures that are usually translated as leechworm, but may actually be something more akin to one of the siblings of Lilith. And I remember hearing a really good presentation on an episode of Coast to Coast AM back in the day by a guy named Sean Manchester, who really did some interesting work in vampirology. But he teased out some things that I had not thought about before in the context of the vampire in the Bible, those being that the vampire was an antichrist figure insofar as that it took this demonic manifestation took life force, it took blood from the victim, whereas Christ, the vampire offering a kind of false eternity, false immortality, whereas Christ gave his blood and offers genuine immortality, genuine eternity. And so I think that nestled within the text are these really important lessons that are rooted in the idea of a vampire, this kind of demonic creature that robs life force or blood from someone. So that's certainly not the only one, and it is hard to pick a favorite, I suppose. But that's one that's always stood out to me, and certainly since I've been teaching coursework on this topic.
Along with that, I think of, for me, the harlot in Revelation 17 and such is, everyone has varying interpretations of who she is, but the concept there is we all see her as a symbolic entity of some kind, and it literally says in Revelation 17:6, the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And of course, everyone, Christians are going, oh yeah, that's obviously symbolic of how she's killing the Christian. Well, right, yeah, but it's saying she's drinking their blood. And interestingly, vampirism, even going back to Dracula and Nosferatu, that the notion had always been embedded there of the Christian notion that you're talking about. Even in the traditional Dracula stories, it was this symbolic notion that's tied to Christ's blood, etc. But it's the same symbolism, and we're not just like finding little, here's a little passage, but like this concept, like you said, Judd, it's in multiple passages of this notion of drinking blood, and what else is that but a metaphor,
Yeah, long before, let's say the Christian horror genre or Christian paranormal genre was even really an ensconced thing in our culture, Bram Stoker, who most people know as the author of Dracula, wrote this novel where essentially there are the kind of folkloric tools that they're using in an apotropaic manner to dispatch with Dracula, steaks and garlic and things like that. But there's also this very palpable Christian religious theme that runs throughout the course of the novel. And it's, as it turns out, Christian faith is the main armament that this small group of people led by Professor Van Helsing use against the king vampire himself, Dracula. And you can certainly see where Stoker gets as an heir to Western thought. You can certainly see where Stoker is drawing from and what he was heavily influenced in. Not just the minutiae of Eastern European folklore, but the broader scope of supernatural evil as it was presented in the Bible.
Doug, what's as a pastor, how would you answer Brian's question? What is the most significant or most terrifying example of horror in the Bible?
I was just thinking about different kinds of genres within horror. So, you have horror as a genre within all movie making, but within horror, you have all kinds of different things itself, right? So you have monster movies, even those have different kinds of monsters that you can talk about, for anything from Godzilla to a vampire, whatever. Those are very different sorts of things. But then you have like slasher or psychological thriller kind of things. Those are very different. So to answer the question is kind of tough, because it depends on if I'm thinking about a monster at the moment, or if I'm thinking about some sort of demonic possession, or if I'm thinking about somebody who's acting really wickedly. But one of them that comes to my mind is this, first of all, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and how, God punishes this wicked city for what they're doing within the city over the course of all this time. And, the one snapshot that we have is that these men want to violate these two men angels that come in. So that drives you back to Genesis 6. So that story is actually built on an earlier story of horror, which is the Watchers coming down and doing what they did. But, and then you have Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. I mean, you can think of that as funny or whatever, but it's not funny. It's completely horrific. I mean, that is true horror, if ever there was such a thing. But my mind doesn't stop there, because it actually goes to the story at the end of Judges, where that Levite and his concubine go to that town, and it's a replay of the Sodom and Gomorrah story, except for on steroids. So it turns out that they end up violating her, and she dies, and then he cuts her into 12 pieces and sends her to the 12 parts of Israel. I mean, if you were to make a movie out of that, what other genre could you possibly call that other than horror?
Absolutely, I agree. Now, but I do know there are plenty of Christians would say, yeah, but it's not the same thing, because that really happened. That's history, and that's evil that men do, right? And they would argue that's how they would argue against
Sure.
that, which is why I've tended to focus on the fictional or the symbolic elements, because those are clearly more like the stories we have today. You know what I mean? Although I agree with you, though, in essence, that is horror. And to even go there and to describe the story as they do, it's definitely horror. But let me give an example of the fictional that's doing the same
Sure.
same thing as that story, and that could be Ezekiel 16 or Ezekiel 23.
Mm-hmm.
And I will only say that. That's a prophecy where God is talking about Israel and Judah, and he likens them to two sisters, like in Oloha and Oholiabah or something, however you say that in Ezekiel 23. But then he also talks about them, I think, more specifically in Ezekiel 16, I think it is, yeah, and it's a little bit more direct, but the idea there is he's describing the spiritual, and this is why I think it's so important to understand this. He's describing the spiritual reality of Israel's apostasy from Yahweh. How, and how does God communicate the seriousness of that? He uses symbolism that is horrific, like the Sodom and Gomorrah event, and he describes Israel and Samaria as two girls who play the whore with other gods and other peoples. And he literally uses descriptions that you would not be able to read these Bible passages to your children until they are of age, more mature, be able to handle it. For instance, he in Ezekiel 23, we read, he describes, like I said, the symbol, the sisters Samaria and Jerusalem, right? And so he describes Samaria as playing the whore while she was mine, meaning God was married to her. She lusted after her lovers, the Assyrian warriors. She bestowed her whoring upon them, the choicest men of Assyria, and defiled herself, these are all sexual terms, with all the idols of everyone after whom she lusted. She did not give up her whoring that she had begun in Egypt. In her youth, men had lain with her and handled her virgin bosom, poured out their whoring lust upon her. He goes on to describe later on that, like, her lovers, these false gods who are described this way, whose sexual members were like those of donkeys and whose issue, semen, was like that of horses. You longed for them as they pressed your bosom and your breast. So, I mean, this is a very, very descriptive. It's not just sexual, it's also horror, because at the end God says he will take her lovers, in other words, these other nations that Israel is uniting with in disobedience against God. He describes their faithlessness as sexual faithlessness, and then their end will be, I will deliver you into the hands of those whom you hate, into the hands of those whom you turned in disgust, the ones you had sex with. They shall deal with you in hatred and leave you naked and bare, and the nakedness of your whoring shall be uncovered. And then in chapter 16, he describes how they will cut you up into pieces. Again, the same thing as what you mentioned.
Right.
And so that's clearly a symbolic fictional parable and so the point of it is this. This is where the power of horror and it's a horror that's sexual as well, right? Which is also, this reminds me of all these slasher movies where the teens are going out and they're having sex and they're getting killed one by one. And while I would admit that that can be exploitative and excessive, and that becomes a debate in and of itself. At what point is how do you deal with sin, and then when does it become exploitative versus revelatory of sin, right, or of evil?
Right.
But just in principle. Ironically, a lot of these slasher films actually have a rooted Judeo-Christian morality because, and of course things have changed in the genre over time, but it was basically the notion that the kids who were living promiscuously and having sex outside of marriage were the ones that got killed, and it was usually the virgin who lived in the end, right?
Right.
And then of course when Scream came along, they sort of turned it on its head, and the modern version is a lot messier and a lot more nihilistic because they're deliberately going against the convention. But in more recent films, I've noticed they're kind of going back to that more traditional concept. So my point here is that those slasher movies are doing very much the same thing of describing that morality as resulting in their destruction and murder, just like God himself used that sort of horror component of cutting up into pieces and rape, mass rape and gang rape and all this kind of stuff, using that as a metaphor for spiritual judgment upon them for their apostasy from God himself. And that's why Ezekiel 16 and 23 are also among my favorite chapters, because I always like to say, why don't you read those to your kids and tell me, the Bible's not rated R. No, it is. And you won't read some of it until they are mature of age.
Yeah, a couple of chapters in Leviticus, too,
I want to respond to this a little bit, Brian. I wasn't expecting this to go here, but I think it's really interesting because, if we are, some of the people who are going to listen to this, I don't know how many with the audience that we have, but some for sure aren't going to like horror. Not everybody has to like horror. That's fine. But some will have like they really don't like horror because of, theological reasons, or it's a ungodly genre or whatever the case might be. And so the fact that I kind of brought up what you said was a real story, and then you bring up what is a fictional story, I think that's a really interesting bridge, because think of an analogy here of a friend of mine. I might have said this before, but he was really struggling with the whole Nephilim thing, and he kept falling asleep on me during our talks. I'm like, this is really rude. Why are you falling asleep on me? He never does that anywhere else, but with this talk he did. And so what is your problem? He goes, well, it's all fake. What are you talking about giants for? So he said it was fake. It reminded me of what you just said. Well, that's just, that's real. I can deal with that. So the way I bridged it to him was to say, well, you believe in Goliath, don't you? And all of a sudden he went, well, yeah. And I said, well, look up his genealogy. Where do you think he comes from? And my point was that I took him from reality to what he thought was fiction, but in reality wasn't fiction. And in the two stories that we gave here, one is what you call reality, but I would argue that he's probably telling that story in a way that is conventional of a horror genre.
Absolutely.
Even though it's reality. And in the same way, what Ezekiel's telling us about Israel and Judah, especially Israel or Judah being even worse than the sister that was that bad. Yeah. Is he's giving a reality using a genre that teaches us about what we are already like. We are wicked, wicked people. Yeah. So I think it's really interesting that you took it in that direction, because I would want to tell people that you don't have to like horror, but understand that the Bible itself uses it on more than one level. It uses it in terms of using fantasy fiction sort of stuff, but it also uses it in terms of telling a real story with very stark imagery that, whatever that corresponded to and the reality of how that looked to the people around him, I don't know. But when you read that story, you cannot help but just go, be repulsed by it.
Yeah, and that in fact that's the goal. But I'm so glad you brought up that qualification, because I always forget to bring this up right up front. Is I actually do agree that horror, like, I want to defend the principle of horror as being a genre that it's not just acceptable, but God uses it in His Word. So therefore, we cannot condemn it as a whole. We might condemn an individual horror story, that that's immoral or whatever. And of course I have. And yet at the same time, I will admit that I definitely understand that horror is not for everyone. And I do not look down or judge those who don't like it, just like I don't want them to judge me. Absolutely. Because I've come to realize it's more the person's emotional capacities as well as their imaginative capacities. Like, my wife can't watch any of that stuff. A lot of wives can't, but my wife specifically can't, because her imagination is so, I guess, receptive to the imagery and the story itself that, whereas I don't know how to describe it, but I feel like it in a way it strikes her soul and psyche with much more reality than mine. Like, I filter it through my mind and imagination as a, this is a parable, or this is a genre. What is it teaching me, etc. And she just sort of drinks from it directly, which is more frightening to her and brings her places that she doesn't feel she can go. And I fully respect that, and which is one of the reasons why my wife has not read any of my novels, because my novels, as you know, have sex, violence, and a lot of horror elements in them, even though they're Bible stories, right? And I've accepted that for a long time ago because of her own sensibility. So people understand we're not arguing that you have to like it.
Yeah.
But you do have to accept that God does it.
Yeah, and there are some Christians, and there are some Christians who recognize in themselves that like Kimberly, a friend of mine who was a huge fan of the Walking Dead series, but the zombie genre as a whole, realized at one point that he had to stop watching it because he was enjoying it too much, and actually was enduring some supernatural events in their home that were not positive.
That's fair.
And when he stopped that and actually did a cleansing of the home, going through the house and praying over each room, and that ended. And Sharon has actually given a presentation on this, wrote a piece about it in a book published by Tom Horn years ago called God's Ghostbusters, Your Brain on Virtual Sin. What is the difference between sacrificing to an idol and or the shedding of blood, which was forbidden by God, told Noah, even if a wild beast sheds human blood, a reckoning will be required, and enjoying the depiction of this in film or in video games? I mean, is there a spiritual difference in the act if you're, say, playing a first-person shooter and enjoying blowing another player's head off, virtually speaking, as instead of doing it in real life? I don't know.
That's another good qualification up front that we need to make. Yeah, this is much more nuanced than just either or. Uh-huh. Absolutely. And I would argue the same thing. I love zombie movies. That's another genre we can step into, and I'll give one example of it. But I recognize that danger as well. Now, understanding the zombie genre, and we can bounce back to if people want to talk more about vampires, that's true. But since we're kind of going this direction, I thought that's interesting because zombies is definitely a very grotesque sort of genre, and as we know, it involves usually bashing in heads or shooting in heads and cutting off heads and stuff like that of the monsters, But it's interesting because that again, not all zombie stuff, but the genre itself has several biblical examples of it. But I would argue that, at least as I see it in today's world, like with The Walking Dead, the dominant sort of theme, one of many themes that the genre itself inherently communicates, is that if you watch it, it's always about a contrast of two ethical systems, and that is, what are zombies? Zombies are human bodies without the soul, however you want to define that, but it's without the soul. And the point is that they're no longer human, but they become monsters because of them, wanting to eat human flesh. And so people have to kill them to survive, right? But most all of the zombie movies, and like one of my favorites is 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later, but also The Walking Dead, if you look closely, they're contrasting those who live by a Christian ethic of sacrifice. Are those, sometimes they die, but they save others, right, instead of themselves. Those are the heroic souls. Those are the humans who are being fully human. And then those characters who seek to protect themselves or to survival versus sacrifice. Those people tend to be the bad people because they end up letting others get eaten or killed and to protect themselves, and they are very selfish people. And that's a dominant theme all the way throughout The Walking Dead. As well as the 28 Weeks Later and most of the zombie movies, right? And to me, that's a very powerful, I see it as the comparison of the Judeo ethic versus the evolutionary ethic, which in a way is sort of an argument against evolution. But one of the, and I'll let you guys also talk about this as well, but I just wanted to read one of my favorite passages, which is Micah 3, and that is, this is another prophecy about the spiritual evil of the leaders of Israel. God himself is using the zombie as a metaphor. He says, "Hear you heads of Jacob, you rulers of house of Israel. Is it not for you to know justice?" You're supposed to be leading and being just. You who hate the good and love the evil. You hate the good and love the evil. You're not ruling right. Of course, this reminds us of Psalm 82 with the watchers, right? But he says, you tear off the skin of my people. You tear the skin off my people and their flesh from their bones. You eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin from them. I mean, this is a grotesque imagery in my mind right now. And break their bones in pieces and chop them up like meat in a pot, like flesh in a cauldron. Okay, maybe that's more cannibalism than zombies, but the idea there is still the same, and that is that when you become less human, when you turn from God, you become less human, and your treatment of other people is a kind of cannibalism, which is exactly what zombies are doing, and they are without soul, right? As well as, cannibalism, whether it's, Hannibal Lecter or what have you, right? But that's another good example of that zombie-like imagery that God is using for righteous means.
I think one of the interesting nuances in the zombie genre is also that zombies represent a kind of postmodern immortality. They, as you pointed out, they're these creatures that are bereft of a soul, and I think that's one of the interesting things of the zombie genre in the past few decades is that they're almost reduced to a kind of naturalism. You reference evolution as kind of the lens that they're viewed through. Whether usually it's some sort of pathogen, right, or some sort of a virus or disease that spreads that causes some sort of rise in the zombie population. So I think there's an interesting intellectual horror there, in that that postmodernism has spread so rapidly and is so infective. And I think that's something that more Christians ought to pay attention to, considering that much of the battlefield, the cultural battlefield, that we find ourselves on these days, is amidst this kind of postmodern immortality, postmodern zombie. Cool.
Yeah.
And in a similar way to the way Jesus kind of reverses the vampire trope, he does the same with the zombie trope. You eat my flesh and drink my blood. And
interestingly, the first century Christians were being accused of being cannibals because of that statement.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the left today will twist everything and you hate children because you're not letting them cut off their body parts to pretend to be different sexes. And you hate children. It's like, no, we're the ones who love children. And you're eating the flesh of deity.
You're forcing them to be born into a world that's on fire. Yeah, it's the other, and by the way, this whole idea is why Sharon and I titled one of our books "Giants, Gods, and Dragons," because again, these are all used in Scripture, in one way or another to convey spiritual truth. I mean, you've got the dragons in Leviathan chapter 41, or Leviathan described as a dragon. I know that most Bible commentators try to pass it off as a crocodile, but crocodile that breathes fire, apparently. But the story in the Bible that has inspired a lot of horror fiction, horror films, is the story of the Gerasene demoniac. We are legion, for we are many. I mean, to me, that makes, just thinking about that, it makes my blood run cold. You get the descriptions in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew has 2 demoniacs. Mark and Luke, it's just 1 each. But this is a guy who's described as somebody who could not even be restrained by iron chains because he was so strong he would break the chains, living amongst the tombs, next to a herd of pigs. And now we have a little better context for understanding why that might be the case. It appears that pigs were often raised, if not exclusively, at least primarily in the ancient Near East, to offer as sacrifices to the dead, which would be these demonic spirits that this guy was afflicted by. But the idea that demons could force you to do this kind of self-harm and imbue you with superhuman strength is terrifying. And we've seen this depicted in films over and over again. Probably the most popular, or the most viewed anyway, film of this genre, The Exorcist.
Yeah.
Now,
and one of the themes that is in all these demonic movies, even the secular ones, right? There's always one of the main characters who is a naturalist or whatever, a materialist, and they don't believe in spirits, and their journey is always, and even series like we've spoke about, evil, and so, there's always a skeptic, and his journey or her journey is they realize that because of their experience with this supernatural evil, they realize that the spirit world is real and God exists to some degree for them, and that's a powerful tale of conversion that these stories enable us to tell. But I got to tell you this though. I recently I can't say which movie it is, but I've written a movie about Jesus for some producers, and I actually have sort of made it like a horror movie because I've focused on the demonic element more. I mean, all movies about Jesus have him casting out demons, but like I have a lot of it because I think it was so important to what was really going on, right? And so it'd be interesting to see if they pull it off and they do it, but. Yeah. The gospel as a horror story.
Well, and that's a really interesting. That's a really interesting point because, as Judd mentioned, with the vampire story as originally popularized by Bram Stoker, it was clearly a tale where it was the power of Christ that allowed them to finally overcome Count Dracula in the end. But as we've gotten into the modern world, that's sort of lost. The same with. Well, even in the movie The Exorcist, the demon, Pazuzu was finally overcome when the younger was it Father Karras?
Marin?
Yeah, who basically taunts the demon into possessing him, and then he jumps out of a window.
Yeah,
it's not like
dumb.
the power of Christ didn't compel the demon to do anything. It's like the sacrifice of the priest. Okay, that's all well and good, but it's not really accurate. And then, of course, he shows up again in Exorcist 3, the one with George C. Scott.
Well, here's something about that. To give Hollywood its due, got to be fair. You're right. Obviously, and the name of Jesus is never allowed in Hollywood movies unless it's a curse word or it is a demonic movie. But even then, it's more symbolic than anything. However, to be fair, there have been recent movies out of Hollywood that actually did have the name of Jesus as the weapon against the demons, and the Conjuring movies are. Of course, I haven't seen all of them, but I know the first one very clearly. The power of Jesus Christ was casting out that demon, and I was like, "Whoa! This is a Hollywood movie." And then, of course, Scott Derrickson, he's a kind of a Christian, I guess, and he's made two movies: The Exorcism of Emily Rose and Deliver Us from Evil. And Deliver Us from Evil is a cop story, genre story, but and they both have those elements of the skeptic who doesn't believe in spirituality, but when he comes confronted with it, it becomes more real. And I don't know if the name of Jesus is used clearly in there, but definitely it's definitely more of a Christian worldview of dealing with demonic possession.
Yeah, you can actually come across some of these things in surprising ways. You remember the kind of semi-comical vampire story Fright Night with Roddy McDowall.
Oh, yeah.
And Chris Sarandon as the next door neighbor moves in, and the teenage kid realizes that he's a vampire. And so, Roddy McDowall playing Peter Vincent, which was a tribute to Peter Cushing and Vincent Price as, legends in that genre. But the kid, confronts the vampire and holds up a cross, and the vampire just looks at him and then crushes it in his hand. You idiot. That only works if you believe it. And then later in the film, he holds up the cross, and it does actually have power to drive him back. And
cool.
So he's ultimately defeated. So even in a silly movie like that, occasionally there's a glimpse of some truth that works its way in there.
Oh, and then remember the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, End of Days? It's like, whoa. It was supposed to be about the Antichrist or something, but Arnold Schwarzenegger was supposed to stop him, and his whole journey was also to rediscover faith, and he could not have victory over the bad guy until he had faith as well. And that was like an action horror, action horror flick with Schwarzenegger. And I remember watching and going, wow, that's really cool. And I heard him, doing an interview where they had talked to in getting, consultation from, various priests or whatever. And they had stressed that, he cannot have physical victory because, here he is, this action guy, and he shoots and kills. Right. But they're like, but his journey has to be, he cannot have physical victory over the supernatural. It must be only through faith. And then they employed that into the story, which again, I applaud Hollywood, although that's a little old of a movie, but still it was made,
How difficult is that, Brian, when you're telling the story to keep that aspect of it true? I know Sharon kind of wrestles with this because it almost seems like a cheat, that when Okay, God enters the picture and suddenly evil's defeated. How do you work that?
Deus ex machina.
Yeah. I didn't remember how to pronounce it. That's why I avoided using the term. So thank you.
God from the machine, meaning, the Greek origins of it was just that, they would have these plays where they would get the Greek characters into impossible situations and couldn't get out of it. And it's like, so the gods would come down and free them.
Right.
And yeah.
And so there's in the hands of less skilled writers, that can be a danger where, everything looks, and then suddenly, the heavens open and everything is fine.
It's a Monty Python movie.
Yeah.
Well, no, that is a difficulty because, and by the way, I in general do agree that you shouldn't do that, because I think that regardless of your spiritual beliefs, there's an earthly side of things that most of the time, is worked out through our personal journeys, and that's how we overcome. The very essence of storytelling is the hero, by fighting the evil, they realize the evil in themselves, and they have to change inside in their own understanding or repentance or whatever, faith, right? And that gives them the ability then to have the external victory to vanquish the enemy in the story. I mean, just in terms of general storytelling. But, here's the thing, though. As Christians, we have to walk a fine line, because it's not Deus ex machina, because God is not, there's not a machine for us, right? We have the Trinitarian God who is providentially controlling all things. But I do have those in my stories, but I try to limit it to, if I'm telling a Bible story and it's a miracle, God did show up, so it's okay, But if I'm creating my own story, fictional story, I would at most allow myself to have one of those moments in a story, just so that it does reinforce my belief in God, regardless of whatever we believe. Even as Christians, like, God is real and he does sometimes show up, and I want to acknowledge that. But you can't rely on it too heavily, because then it does become how many times in our own personal lives, I guess there might be a lot of people who claim to have a lot of miracles in their lives. But I mean, just, speaking to normal Christians who are living their Christian lives, how often does God do this dramatic miracle like parting the Red Sea? Right? No. He does providentially do things in our lives, and I'm sure, and I would acknowledge he's done miracles, but they're not these fantastic parting of the Red Sea kind of things. It's really more like, you look back and say, oh, wow, he protected me from this or that. Now, again, I know there's going to be charismatics or something who might, argue much more strongly than that. But as a storyteller, that's how I approach it. God's working within us more than anything.
Yeah, and there are things that I think a lot of us could point to and say, that I have no explanation, no natural explanation for that. But if it happens over and over again in order to drive the plot along, then the whole story doesn't ring true, and then it misses. Yeah. Then you've defeated your own purpose in trying to convey some supernatural truth by telling a story that is clearly not believable.
Yeah.
I'm curious about something. Kind of changing the subject. So I decided I wanted to come home today and prepare by watching a scary movie. And so I looked up scariest movies in insane asylums. And up came
In the Mouth of Madness.
Up came the movie called Session 9, which I think I had seen before.
Yeah.
And so my question is going to involve the idea of scare and fear and horror and what you guys think of about that. But to lay it out, I watched it and it wasn't scary at all. And I was really disappointed because I'm like, this wasn't scary. I just wasted an hour and a half watching a movie that wasn't scary, and that's what I wanted. So I actually probably ended up missing some really interesting things because I was wanting one thing out of the horror movie, and I got something totally different. In that particular movie, they're in an insane asylum, so you're thinking that it's going to be all demonic or ghost sort of stuff, right? And they kind of tease that, and you're thinking through the whole movie, well, when's it going to come? And then at the end of the movie, it turns out the guy's basically a serial killer and goes crazy and kills all his buddies. But you're left with kind of this dilemma of, was there something there that was also behind it? So it in that way is really interesting.
Yeah.
But I wasn't scared. And so my
Really?
question is, what is it about scare and fear and that whole part of horror that we're drawn to, and why is it so important, and how should we think about that as Christians?
Yeah, because that's another objection. Christians will say, "Oh, horror is just it focuses on fear, and we should not fear. We should have because we have the fear of the Lord, so we should not fear the world. We shouldn't focus on fear." So that's also something Christians bring up.
It's a valid point, but I would suggest it in the context of knowing thy enemy, at least understanding what they're capable of and what their motivations are. I think horror can be a useful vehicle for conveying that. I mean, what do demons want? What do fallen angels want? What would hell be like if you got dragged off there? Those, I think, can be useful in conveying some, this is the reason Jesus had to go to the cross.
If the horror doesn't have true fear in it, and I'm not saying this one didn't, it just didn't meet my expectations. It was a different kind of a fear, I think. But if it doesn't have that in it, then it's like, what's the point? That's kind of what you think when you're in a horror movie. Even a comedy horror movie that's making fun of things like Scream might still has scare and fear in it. If it doesn't have that, it doesn't work. Why is that? Why do we need that fear and that scare? What?
That is a good question. And again, I think for some people, it is not healthy, as we discussed earlier, but for others, it's enjoyable. I mean, the Alien franchise, that first Alien movie where Ripley realizes suddenly she's in the space capsule and the creature is in there with her, and she's trying to figure out how to get it out of the ship while she's clearly terrified. That is very engaging. You're drawn to her character because she's heroic while she's terrified at the same time, which again rings true. She's fighting through the fear. I don't know. That's not one that you watch because you enjoy the gore. I don't think, but there are other films that are horror, like the Saw movies. To me, that was just torture porn. I didn't see anything.
One could make that argument, sure.
Yeah.
And I would argue that so we would all have to acknowledge that fear in and of itself is not intrinsically wrong. My favorite example is like, if you're swimming out in the ocean and someone else sees a shark, they want to instill fear in you so you get the heck out of the water, right? And that's good fear. So there is good fear. And so, well, what is that? And of course, that touches upon some of the very first things, I brought up, which is, fearing consequences, right? The purpose is you frighten someone, and by showing them the consequences of bad or immoral choices, and the fear that comes from seeing people make those choices and experience the results, the horror results of that. For example, like I mentioned earlier, young kids having sex, without morality and such, and the idea, the fear is to affirm righteousness. Like to live righteously, and that's one component, right, of what fear can do. Fear is an affirmation of this is why you want to live righteously, because you don't want to end up like this. Just like you don't want to be eaten by a shark, so you should get the heck out of the water. And it's only going to be fear that causes you to get out of the water. So you have to experience the fear. And I would argue seeing some of these stories, not all of them, but seeing some stories is the fear is an emotion that is also part of our humanity, just like the sentiments of romantic feelings, fear, the adrenaline of like action, where you get this sense of courage. Oh, I'm watching this good guy take out the bad guys, and I want to be courageous like that to protect the innocent. Things like that. So fear, I think fear does that. One of those elements is it points you towards righteous living and helps you avoid consequences. Those are a couple components, I would say.
I think that it's interesting that, we think about how a horror movie will work its way out from beginning to end, and it has to have fear. but it usually doesn't start with fear. It usually starts something serene and happy, kind of pull you in and like you're a fish on a line, right? But it also doesn't end that way either. Yeah. They always resolve, right? So it's almost like when you go to a horror movie and you want to be scared, you also want there to be an ending where you're not afraid anymore.
Yeah,
that's the way horror works, right?
Although almost all horror movies will have the last shot will be showing that the little tentacle that was cut off the monster starts wiggling in the grass, and that's setting up for the sequel. It's right? More than that. It really is more than that. It's that evil will continue on if you don't continue to fight it, but also to be vigilant. And I used to think that was sort of like it's saying that evil wins. In my lesser educated days, it's like that's saying evil will never be defeated and God can do it. But no. If you look in the Bible, I was just thinking about this the other day. It's like one of the things about the Bible I've noticed is like, man, all the stories of God and his victory with his people of God, it's all like that. Like he always does a vanquishing, but not fully, right? Like the it was the whole element of I was just talking the other day about the Nephilim thing, right? Joshua 11, Joshua wiped out all the Anakim in the land, and it says he did all that God said, and God gave them all the land he promised, but he left some Anakim in Philistia. And then and we know what happens is then that ends up David has to fight the Rephaim, right? And he has to wipe out the Rephaim. And if you look at Israel's stories, there's always like that. Even with the victories, there's always some kind of yes, but man is still sinful, and we've got to be vigilant. I would argue the point of that is, that it's not that evil is victorious. It's that if we are not vigilant, because we are always having of a sinful nature, we must always be vigilant about fighting evil and never think that we've vanquished it fully in this life.
Judd, let me bring you back in here as a biblical anthropologist. Through your online courses that you offer, why did you choose to include courses for people to learn about things like vampires, werewolves, witches, zombies, etc.?
I chose them because of the palette that the demonic realm had to work with, and in studying folklore and mythology through the lens of anthropology, it dawned on me. It's something that our friend, the late Mike Heiser, said one time, that it only takes one story, one account of, in the case that he was saying, one account of alien abductions or UFO experiences. It only takes one of these things to bust the paradigm wide open for it to be true. It only takes one of those accounts being true. And in surveying the folklore of the cultures of the planet and looking at the mythologies, the same kind of truth is applicable there. It only takes, because these were stories that circulated orally. In many cases, they existed for certain people in real space and time, and it only takes one of those stories to be real. And as Christians, we should be familiar with, we should know the kind of variety, indeed theatricality, that demonic realm can utilize. And in my mind, that includes creatures like vampires and werewolves and zombies and ghouls, and these kind of nightmarish creatures that exist in the folklore and mythology of the world. So a Christian looking at these things through the lens of the Bible can become to know that that's part of the repertoire of the demonic realm. And certainly to bring it home to what we've been talking about today, the horror genre is a great mechanism for bringing that to at least the consideration of Christians, that this kind of supernatural evil is possible. And indeed, there may be evidence, in my mind, there is evidence to support that these kinds of manifestations are possible.
Mm. I know that's why Sharon does what she does with her Red Wing Saga series. And Brian, you've got some projects in the works that are going to, I think, make this very explicit, especially as the worldview, these literal doctrines of demons, propagate or have propagated through our culture and our society, especially through academia. Sadly, as we're getting close to an hour here, I was hoping we'd have time to discuss some specific examples of things from Hollywood. We mentioned a couple, but maybe our next program we can focus on each of us bringing in a few of our favorite examples of how some films or television series or novels have managed to use this genre to teach some spiritual truth.
Can I say one more thing then?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Not to extend it too far, but there's one other component that a lot of this is, we've already touched on it, but it's a lot deeper. And it's, the very first thing, I mentioned Daniel, right? And the Daniel beast, right? We know that they were like hybrid beasts, right? And then Revelation reflects those very same beasts later. And this notion of the beast, right? We talk about that with eschatology and Revelation, and what is the beast and such. And of course, there's two beasts in Revelation. There's the land beast and the sea beast. But the idea there is that the description of the beast, why does John even use that imagery? Is that just something he came up with? No, it's actually it's rooted in an apocalyptic genre, which is horror oriented, because the notion of the beast, and you go all the way back to Daniel, and Daniel's saying the same thing, this beast with the iron claws and all this kind of stuff, right? And it's devouring people and all the various beasts that Daniel describes. And of course, this is what brings to my mind is all the monster movies, right? That some people think they're such a waste, but in a very real sense, the biblical usage of the beast term is actually, I would argue, it's rooted in the theological belief that human authorities or powers, because ultimately you look and you see that these beasts are representative of empires or governments or rulers, right? When the rulers do not follow God's law, they become beasts. They become like animals. Of course, more than just animals, without like a human without a soul, so to speak, right? It's like they're not just animalistic, although that's a component, right? It's a beast, but it's without the soul, without God, they are marauding monsters, marauding animals, right? And so that's sort of the I would say, one of the theological elements of that beast imagery in the Bible. These human authorities without God, without God's law, they become monstrous animalistic beasts who kill and destroy and eat people, right? And of course, we think of things like Godzilla and stuff, but and this is kind of a Frankenstein motif, but you think of movies like Jurassic Park, right? And Jurassic Park is that same thing where it's like man in his hubris, when he has no morality. There's that scene where Jeff Goldblum says, we've been so interested in cloning dinosaurs to see what we can do, we haven't bothered to figure out whether or not we should do it, because when you clone the dinosaurs, look what happens. They come back and they bite you and eat you. And that's the same notion, right? And so I think that's a very powerful, one of my favorite. I think Frankenstein for me is probably my favorite horror story of all time, because so many stories go back to that original. And if I could just mention one book here that I think, if people are interested in going deeper, other than reading Judd's material, there's a great book called Monsters from the Id by Michael Jones. It might be hard to get a hold of, but it explains a lot of the origins of Victorian horror, the werewolves, the vampire. If you look back in terms of just, at least recent storytelling, a lot of these tropes that we're familiar with, whether it's Dracula, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, right? Of course, there's ancient examples of that in their own way, but specifically as we know them in our culture, it kind of goes back to the Victorian era. And all those original stories, Robert Louis Stevenson, et cetera, Michael Jones brings out this point that they were reflecting that Judeo-Christian side of Victorian understanding of human nature, that when you suppress the truth in unrighteousness, right? When you suppress the truth, you you cannot hide the ultimate monster. It will always come out because human nature is essentially has that sinful nature to it. So thus, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, he's hiding, he's something at night, just like the werewolf is, right? And so it's that Victorian motif of what we've been talking about, and I think that's a powerful. Again, goes back to this notion of affirming the original sin, sinful human nature, which is something that's denied in today's society. Yes, it's common parlance for us as Christians, but in a very real way, it's denied in society. And so horror films, the modern day version of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde might be Fight Club. It's not quite horror per se, but it's the same motif of when you suppress your evil. And I can list off a bunch of other movies. When you suppress your evil, you can't ultimately do that. It comes out. Your sin will find you out. A biblical concept. Your sin will find you out. You can't hide it. You can't. Or when man suppresses it in unrighteousness, it still comes out in his idolatry. And so that's a powerful, first step in the gospel for sure. But that's that you can see this how this all links back to the same purposes that the scripture, I think, are using monsters as a metaphor for is people who try to hide their evil, people who deny God, they become monsters. In a general notion, I think that's what's going on.
That's one reason that a lot of modern horror, by the way, just rings hollow because they want the supernatural evil, but they don't want to counterbalance it with the supernatural good. And when you take that element out of it, then all that's left is, we flawed and, failing humans taking matters into our own hands and destroying these monsters with, dynamite or whatever. It just doesn't make any sense. This is a conversation I'd like to continue, or of course, I'm always open to suggestions because you guys come up with better ideas than I do. But if we want to take this out in maybe another month and just come up with ideas on or recommendations for horror that teaches some supernatural truth. I mean, we even some science fiction horror like Signs, the M. Night Shyamalan movie. Is a really good example, but we can kick that around. One thing I do know for sure is that God willing, we'll be back again next month. Brian Godawa, Doug Van Dorn, Dr. Judd Burton. Check the show notes below the program, whether you're watching or listening. If you're consuming this on our app, I will put a link to Brian's article below. The app allows us to link directly to websites and things like that, and articles that are helpful. So we will link to Brian's article on horror as an apologetic. And fellows, look forward to doing this again next month. Check the show notes below this program, wherever you are watching or listening, for the website links for Doug Van Dorn, Brian Godawa, Dr. Judd Burton. They will be there. Thanks to Brian for reminding me to put those links there. Every time. So these guys are volunteering their time to be on this program. So the least we can do is direct your attention to their work, which has been of great help. We are a, not to sound cliche, but a mutual admiration society, which is why we enjoy doing these programs on a monthly basis. So coming up, PTSD of the worst kind. No, not post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic shopping disorder. Seriously, columnist for a major publication freaking out because of too much choice. Bless their pointy little heads. Straight ahead on A View from the Bunker.
Hey, guess what month it is? And that's why maybe we're wearing red, white, and blue.
It's July.
It's July, which means not only that, the United States celebrates Independence Day, but also anniversary of something big.
Oh, yes, the 1947 Roswell crash, which occurred over 4th of July weekend.
It did. In fact, in 2017, you and I and Josh Peck all went to Roswell to see exactly what happened and get some expert interviews. And then you wrote a book.
Yes, Josh and I wrote the book, The Day the Earth Stands Still, about the phenomenon, because For many people, the UFO phenomenon is not about figuring out how we can travel to the stars. It is really a religion,
And
answering the big questions of life. Why are we here? Where did we come from? What happens when we die?
And it is back in the news. So that is the main reason we've decided to bring back a special from last summer. If you get this book, and you will get these two practically free.
Yes.
Because the whole package, you're going to save $30.
Yes.
It's only $35 for all three. You get the book, the two Sci-Friday crazy.
Best of deals is 14 hours of video
Oh, yeah.
on the between the two Best of Sci-Friday. And we do address the UFO phenomenon on some of these episodes. $35 plus shipping and handling, available now only at our store online, gilberthouse.org/store. Walking the walk every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker, and I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at vftv.net. My own website, derekpgilbert.com, but the web hub for everything we do is gilberthouse.org. gilberthouse.org. That's where you'll find links to all of our various and sundry programs, including our weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship, our weekly broadcast program, Unraveling Revelation, these podcasts, and our original podcast, PID Radio, Peering into Darkness, the program that started it all back in 2005, and archive programs now going back to 2005, available through our app. And again, you'll find our app at gilberthouse.org/app. I keep forgetting to mention, and I should, because video, communicating via video is growing in popularity. I can't tell you how often we hear people who want to know more about a concept but don't have time to read. I mean, that's a problem for many of us. I don't have time to read as much as I would like. I have less time to watch video. I actually absorb information more quickly through reading, but I'm weird. A lot of people prefer video, and so we want to make you aware of our streaming video site. It is gilberthouse.org/video, and that will take you to a place where you can download or get eternal access. Not eternal, but you can rent or you can buy our video teachings, and also our tour videos, our Wars of the Gods series from Israel. We've got another one coming out before the end of this year, and then another special video just dedicated to the pre-tour expedition that we just made to Israel. You can rent these teachings. We've been recording video going back to 2005 at conferences, here at home, at various presentations and topics. We got a lot of video out there. And so if you find something that is of interest or value to you, you can rent for as little as $3 for 7 days, or again, buy permanent access to the videos. Again, more on that on our website, gilberthouse.org/video. Well, I'd never heard of PTSD in terms of post-traumatic shopping disorder, but we are now reliably informed because it's published in The Atlantic, which is a serious publication. Not a conservative publication, of course. Author Adam Fleming Petty, writing in The Atlantic about his high anxiety suffered after a recent trip to the grocery store. And I will quote from the article. On a recent afternoon while running errands before I had to pick up my kids from school, I froze in the orange juice aisle of a big box store. So many different brands lay before me. Minute Maid, Simply, Tropicana, Dole, Florida's Natural, Sunny D, not to mention the niche organic labels. And each brand offered juices with various configurations of pulp, vitamins, and concentrate. The sheer plenitude induced a kind of paralysis. Overwhelmed by the choices on offer, I simply could not make one. I left the store without orange juice. Even when you manage to make a choice, Petty writes, you can find yourself wondering whether you made the right one. Sure, that Chobani strawberry yogurt was pretty good, but what if you'd gotten Oikos instead? Or Fage, or is it Fage? I don't know. Or those Yoplait whips. Yes, Yoplait whips indeed. Through his lens, this modern benefit seems to be nothing more than a stress-inducing nightmare. But I continue. In some areas of my life, like picking out clothing, a brand is important to me. I know which label of jeans fits me best, but I really don't care about the brand of granola I buy. My groceries don't need to be the absolute best on the market. I just don't want them to be the worst. A solid B+ is good enough for me. Mercifully, there exists a portion of the retail sector I think of the single option store, or SOS. The offerings at these establishments are deliberately whittled, typically leaving only a handful of each item to choose from. Yes, SOS. Single option store. He sent out a call for help, and thankfully, and the rest of the article is in praise of Aldi. Now, it's not really a commercial for Aldi. Frankly, we love shopping at Aldi. I wish there was one closer to us because really their store brands are pretty good and the prices are really great. But he goes on to talk about how this has made his life easy. The SOS single option store is good at what it does, providing limited mid-tier quality food options and maybe chipping away at my hundreds of daily decisions. I'll gladly take that trade-off for the time it saves me, as well as the mental space it clears. Now, on my afternoon errand runs, I can head to my local SOS, get some store-brand orange juice, and bask in the freedom of not having had to make any choice at all. End quote. Well, Petty is making a point here, and I'm not sure it's quite the one that he intends. Oh, yes, he's kind of throwing this out there, sort of a tongue-in-cheek clickbait article by declaring that having less choice is better. But on a deeper level, you know that there are some people out there, you know, the type, those who are racked with guilt because of our luxurious lifestyles here in the West, who will agree, yes, it isn't right that we have so much to choose from. It's wasteful. It's extravagant. It shouldn't be allowed. And they are the types like the Just Stop Oil folks in the UK who tie up traffic to try to promote the idea that petroleum products are evil and killing the world. There will likely be at some point a group that will take this idea and say, yes, the government needs to whittle down our choices, eliminate all these high-end, expensive brands of orange juice, and offer us just a mid-tier quality level in order to free us up to do more creative things. You know, the kind of stuff that artificial intelligence and robotics is supposed to do for us by freeing us from actually having to go to work. These are the kind of people who will opine that perhaps the old state-run stores offered by, you know, the old Soviet Union were probably a pretty good idea. Come on, Mr. Petty, put on your big boy pants. When you go to the store, man up, make a decision, and then stand by it. And to all of you who actually stress over the fact that we here in the West have the blessing of choice, bless your pointy little heads. We got a couple of things to tell you about. Just a couple of weeks away from visiting Morningside with our good friend Aaron Lipkin, CEO of Lipkin Tours, and also the producer of the Hidden Israel series of DVDs. Aaron is a very prolific and expert pilot of a high-def drone video drone, that is. He has graciously allowed us to use his drone video in our most recent Israel tour video, and the next couple of videos we got coming out, we will also be making use of his footage, which I know is an old term because we don't actually have feet of, film anymore in the modern digital age, but there it is. Anyway, he will be joining us for a taping of the Jim Bakker Show on Tuesday, July 25th. That's 2023, of course. And this is open to the public and free. So if you're in the Ozarks on Tuesday, July 25th of this year, 2023, you are welcome to join us. Aaron will be talking about archaeology in Israel and his role in helping secure the lead curse tablet found at the site of Joshua's altar, showing that there were literate Hebrews in the land well before skeptics and minimalists believe. And we may be talking about our most recent tour and our expedition and how Aaron helped us visit sites like Gilgal Rephaim, the Serpent Mound of Bashan, and the massive dolmen near the Shamir Kibbutz with the 50-ton capstone. Again, that's Tuesday, July 25th at Morningside. We've got information at our website, gilberthouse.org. Also on our app, there is a calendar section inside the app with all of our upcoming events in there, and it does have a map. So if you need directions to Morningside, you can find that in there as well. That following, just that same week, we will be traveling to the Dayton, Ohio area for the Go Therefore Conference. That's in Brookville, Ohio. Dr. Mike Spalding, Kathy Spalding, putting this on at Neil Peterson's church, the Harvest Revival Center in Brookville. We'll be there with Dr. Michael Lake, L.A. Marzulli, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, Coach Dave Daubenmeier, David Hevner, Dr. Greg Reed, Thomas Dunn, Vicki Joy Anderson, Kenny C., David Paxton, Randy Conway. This is going to be a great gathering. So please take advantage of this. Oh, Pastor Casper McLeod. I can't forget Casper. Please, if you're in the area or if you can travel, come on, join us. It's $59 registration and well worth it. The facility is a great setting for this. If you can't travel, but you want to take advantage of the information that will be presented live, well, it's not live streaming, but it's slightly delayed, but it's almost real-time video, and you can take advantage of that as well. Sign up for that at the website, gothereforeconference.com. You can also get tickets to register there as well. gothereforeconference.com. In October, Saturday the 28th, going to be at an event called the Pitchfork and Hoe Gathering in Valley City, North Dakota. Details on that are forthcoming. And, of course, we are looking forward to next March when we return to Israel, God willing, with our special guest, Timothy Alberino. This will be like this is an adventure, but it will be like a rolling conference through the Holy Land, and we invite you to join us. You can find out more online and reserve your place at gilbertsinisrael.com. gilbertsinisrael.com. That'll direct you to the Lipkin Tours website, and you can find out all the information you need there. And again, reserve your spot to join us in Israel next March 31st through April 9th of 2024. And we hope we see you in the Holy Land. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us this week. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, thank you. Subscribe, share, but as a backup, at least please download our free app to your smartphone or tablet. If you get a spare moment, if you're listening on a podcatcher, if you could leave us a review at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, wherever fine podcasts are sold. Our announcer is the inimitable DC Good. And A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, not commercial, no derivatives, 4.0 international license. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.